Hey everyone! Today we're going to be talking about episode 3 of his Dark Materials, The Spies. I liked most of this episode. There were a few things that stuck out to me and kind of rubbed me the wrong way, so I'm going to go ahead and give this episode a B+. Just as the last episode was all about Mrs. Coulter, this episode was really about the Egyptians, and I loved seeing Lyra interact with that community and become a part of it in some way, but there were a few moments that I thought needed some adjusting. We're finally seeing Lyra surrounded by grown-ups who respect her autonomy to some degree and who seem to want to trust her and be trusted by her. This episode really brought to life so many things that are in the background of the books. We get to see the logistical side of all of the things that are kind of glossed over in exposition, and I've got to say, they're really awesome. The one thing that really I felt let this episode down was John Faw's speech that he gives at the roping in London. Let's dig into the details. The episode started with Lyra basically in the back of a gobbler van. I was incorrect. I had really thought at the end of episode 2 that it was probably John Faw or Fardercorm who had intercepted the gobblers when we see Lyra being captured, but it was not. It was the gobblers themselves. She's in a van, she's covered in a net, and all of a sudden the Egyptians are interfering. Tony Costa, who has a kerchief over his mouth, is revealed, and he ends up rescuing Lyra. Mrs. Coulter enters Jordan College very dramatically, and with a whole lot of friends, she brings the might of the magisterium down on Jordan and down on the master of Jordan specifically. This is something that happened in the background of the Golden Compass. Mrs. Coulter is basically bringing hell on earth, and I thought this was really well executed. We see her basically storm the place. All of these magisterium soldiers are ripping through the campus of Jordan and Oxford at large, presumably. They're tearing up the library, which was particularly heartbreaking to watch. Mrs. Coulter enters Jordan telling the magisterium folks, find me something heretical or illegal. She is there to get something that she can use as leverage. She finds the master of Jordan and enters his study. Mrs. Coulter sneers at the idea of scholastic sanctuary. This is the master's excuse that she doesn't have any right to be there. There is such a thing as scholastic sanctuary, and she has to respect the domain of the university and the fact that they are immune to some of the rules that the magisterium has. She is not on board with that and basically says scholastic sanctuary is just another way of protecting bloated privilege. I really loved this line. I think it is a great channel into her frustration, both with the idea that academics are immune to the law, but it might also be an insight into her personally. We know that she is one of the few female scholars, and she definitely doesn't fit into the scene of academia. She's probably struggled quite a bit in her professional life to make a name for herself, and I think she's using this as a great opportunity to kind of take some swipes at an institution that might not have been very welcoming to her. She also comments that if scholars really needed scholastic sanctuary, they could get around that by obscuring their true motives more cleverly than they are. I think the idea of scholastic sanctuary has got to be one of the bigger themes of His Dark Materials show. It's brought up repeatedly, and I think way too often to be a casual passing notion that is tied to just the story. I think this is something that the showrunners probably want us to think about more carefully. Censorship, the idea that academic thinking is kind of endangered. This does not surprise me at all. I think Philip Pullman himself is a pretty political guy. I'm sure he has lots of ideas on censorship and banning, especially because his own work has been banned and censored. Mrs. Coulter confronts the master thinking that he has Lyra hidden somewhere, and he basically tells her, like, look lady, I took care of her for 12 years. She moved in with you, and now all of a sudden she's missing. This is your fault. This is on you. He says, you've already done the worst thing that you can do. Mrs. Coulter does not respond well to that, and we see her ripping pages out of books and tossing them into the fire, which was a nice throwback to the last episode when she's tossing the kids' letters into the fire. She's got a thing for destroying documents. Lyra is taken to stay with Ma and Billy Costa on their boat after she's been rescued. She doesn't seem particularly happy about this chain of events, but Makosta herself does, and it looks like she is thrilled to have a kid to take care of. This was one of the few things that I didn't really love in the show. There's such a great backstory between Lyra and the Costas in the books, and I think it's one of the great moments of comic relief. Before the book starts, we learn that Lyra basically stole the Costas' boat looking for this mysterious thing called the bung. Theoretically, if you take the bung out, the boat sinks, and she spends a whole afternoon trying to sink the boat. It doesn't happen, but she feels like the Costas have it out for her. She thinks that she has a reputation with Egyptians as this kid who's up to no good and who might not be so welcome. This is a great moment in the book because when she's finally taken to meet John Fa and Farder Coram later, she's very concerned that they're going to tell her off, and it turns out to be really funny because they've heard about her. They're actually delighted to meet her. It's a funny thing, it's not a bad thing. So without that backstory, her relationship with the Costas doesn't really have the same depth. We see that Lyra is brave in meeting the Egyptians and encountering John Fa and Farder Coram, but in the show, she's brave for a different reason. When Lyra is taken to meet John Fa and Farder Coram after landing in the Egyptian community, the scene is a little bit confrontational. She is not happy to be there, and she says that she feels like she's being held captive yet again, just by different people this time. John Fa is not quite the soft, older gentleman that he is in the book. He does take the time to say, "We're here to protect you for your own sake. We want to keep you safe. Hopefully you can trust us." And he actually asks her, "Will you stay with us?" And she agrees. But there isn't the same dynamic. There isn't the same respect or deference that she has been told to show to these two men. Lord Boreal goes to the Magisterium and he receives the verbal beating of a lifetime by someone who we see in the credits is called Fra Pavel. In the book, Fra Pavel is the alethiometrist who works for the Magisterium, and it does seem like in the show he knows something that might be beyond the Magisterium gossip ring, but he basically tells Lord Boreal that Mrs. Coulter's raid on Jordan was done badly and boldly, and they're both gonna pay for it. Pan and Lyra have a lot of quiet moments together on Makosta's boat, and in one of the first that we see, he tells Lyra that he thinks that she should give the Egyptians a chance and trust them. As always, Pan is the voice of reason here. There's a great scene when Makosta pulls Lyra into the kitchen on the boat and says that she wants to teach Lyra how to cook. Lyra has no idea why she would need that particular skill, but she does seem game for it and is really delighted when Makosta shows her a trick, I'm assuming with gunpowder. But this was a really sweet moment, not because of the cooking, but it was a great time to see the connection between Lyra and Makosta being developed. Makosta takes a second and says, "We'll make you a great Egyptian woman." And the idea that she's including Lyra in her community is very sweet. It's not something that Lyra is accustomed to. Makosta says, "You'll be whatever you want to be. That's your path. Your choice, yours alone." And it's probably the first time that we've seen an adult not trying to mold her somehow. Mrs. Coulter wanted to turn her into a mini-me, and Makosta is saying, "You're going to be the person that you need to be, and I'm not going to decide that for you." Lyra and Farder Coram spend some time talking on a boat about demons. Farder Coram is really a source of wisdom and life experience in the books, and I think the series is continuing down that vein. There's also a brief moment when Farder Coram and Pan talk to each other, and I really love that because to me, it symbolized that there is a trust between them. He also says something that I thought was a nice throwback to the first episode. He says that a lot of people wish that their demons settle as lions, but they get poodles instead. I think this is a pretty direct reference to the scene when Lyra is in the crypt and she says that she thinks Pan wants to be a lion, but she thinks that he'll become a sloth. Farder Coram says that people are sometimes unhappy with their demon's final shape, and that probably reflects an unhappiness they have within themselves. Farder Coram asks Lyra if she wants to go see the gobbler that they caught, and she says yes. I thought this was a very interesting moment in the episode. As far as I remember, it's not something that we ever see in the book, and we certainly never see Lyra witnessing it, but she basically is taken down and she sees Benjamin de Ruyter interrogating a gobbler in a cold, dark room, and it's implied that there has been some violence. And Fardakorm asks Lyra, is this okay? Lyra says that the gobblers do worse to kids, so this is fine with her. And I thought this was a really great way to navigate Lyra's sense of morality and what her values are. We know that Lyra is not a very gentle girl. She's got some grit to her, and I think this was a great way to understand that her moral compass might not be pointing straight north. Lyra's character becomes just a little bit deeper. She's got a stomach that can handle this. Back in our Oxford, we see Boreal driving to what looks like a cabin in the woods to meet his associate Thomas and learn more about Stanislaus Grumman. Of course, my husband noticed that Boreal is driving a Tesla, which I think makes perfect sense for his character. We see Boreal meet Thomas. We learn about Stanislaus Grumman and that he is actually not from Lord Boreal's Oxford. He's from our Oxford, and he's traveled the reverse direction. We learn that he is not named Stanislaus Grumman. He is really named Colonel John Perry, and he is part of the Royal Marines, or at least was at some point. We also, more importantly, learn that he's married. His wife has an ongoing issue with mental health, and he has a son. We finally get a closer look at the images of Stanislaus Grumman, aka John Perry, and he is played by Andrew Scott. I was very surprised when I heard about this casting. Andrew Scott is a terrific actor, but I will always think of him as Moriarty from the Sherlock series. He's got such a penchant for complete creepiness, some sociopathic tendencies. Obviously, he's a wonderful performer, and I'm really interested to see how he's going to take on a very serious, very responsible, non-psychopathic role like this. The Magisterium sends plenty of zeppelins and plenty of police boats looking for Lyra, and we see them breach the Egyptian community. They start boarding Egyptian boats, Ma Costa's included, and they're looking for Lyra. We see a police officer or Magisterium minion holding a photo of Lyra and making John Fall look at it, asking him, have you seen her? Meanwhile, Lyra is hiding behind, I think, the kitchen sink, and a Magisterium guy with a dog demon spends quite a while sniffing through Ma Costa's boat, looking through things, really doing a good job searching for her. Ma Costa spends this time brilliantly berating the Magisterium for not looking for her own missing son. She has his picture and says, why aren't you looking for my kid? He's been missing and you don't seem to care. I thought this was not only a great deflection device on her part, but also kind of a bitter and sad reflection on our society. Mrs. Coulter spends some time sitting in Lyra's now empty bedroom on her bed, marinating in her anger, I guess. And this was the weirdest scene and probably my favorite scene in the entire episode. She has some rage coursing through her face. We see her clench her hand around a blanket, and then the golden monkey appears in the doorway watching her. He looks pretty apprehensive about the shitstorm that he knows is about to break. And then, out of nowhere, he breaks the fourth wall, and he walks into the bedroom and closes the door. And while he's closing the door, we see feathers from Lyra's pillows flying everywhere, and we know that she is ripping the shit out of this bedroom. I thought this was so weird, and I actually paused so I could laugh and say, what the fuck? So strange. I loved it. I loved every part of it. After the Magisterium finally gives up and stops searching Ma Costa's boat, Ma Costa lets Lyra out of her hiding place behind the sink, and we see Lyra run outside. She and Ma Costa have what is a very painful conversation about what's going on. Lyra expresses her extreme frustration that Mrs. Coulter is never going to stop looking for her. She doesn't know who she can trust. She doesn't even know if she can trust Ma Costa, and she doesn't understand what the hell is going on. Primarily, she wants to know why Mrs. Coulter is so insistent, and she wants to know the truth. Ma Costa tells her that the truth is complicated, and yes, she's right that Mrs. Coulter will never stop, but there are some truths that are better left unknown. Lyra is having none of that, and she screams that she is so bored of hearing that. I really liked this line because I felt like it is what so many kids experience when they're told by the adults in their lives that they're not old enough, they're not mature enough, they're not experienced enough to know some hard or painful truth. I think this is Lyra's character to a T, and this was a great moment when we really saw her exert her own strength, her own voice, and try to regain some autonomy. Ma Costa finally relents relents and she tells her the whole story about Lyra's birth, about how Asriel and Mrs. Coulter fell in love while Mrs. Coulter was married to Edward Coulter. Mrs. Coulter got pregnant, Ma Costa was the nurse, Lyra was sent to a nunnery, and then the Great Flood hit and Asriel took her to Jordan College, which is where we, of course, pick up. Lyra is absolutely devastated by the news that Mrs. Coulter is her mother. We see the pain all over her face. Finding out that your dad has been lying to you your entire life and has abandoned you multiple times has got to be very difficult to digest. But learning that your mom is probably the most evil person you've ever met and also kind of a sociopath, that is a whole new level, and she wants to be as far away from that reality as possible. Ma Costa also speculates that Mrs. Coulter is the way she is, horrible, nasty, rotten, because she's been through so much, and after Asriel killed her husband, Edward Coulter, she was really made a pariah. She was a woman who had a baby out of wedlock. Her husband is now dead, her lover is penniless and has nothing to offer her, and this kind of explains a lot of the tension between Mrs. Coulter and Asriel, but I don't know if that is really why she is who she is. I like that Ma Costa offered that as an explanation, though. At the end of this conversation, Ma Costa tells Lyra that she really wants to be there for her. She wants to take care of her. And then she gives Lyra some space and she walks away. There is a very small moment at the end when Pan actually follows Ma Costa. We see his little ermine shape pop up in the middle of the field as he's walking towards her, and because he is Lyra's demon, this means that Lyra also has to follow him. I thought that was a really nice touch. And again, great visual reminder that Pan is the voice of reason here. He is the light in the darkness in Lyra's decision-making, but also her emotional landscape. Cue Mrs. Coulter drunkenly walking across the ledge of her balcony at the top of her building. She is at her most reckless. Even the golden monkey is very worried about her, and we see him sanely in the window watching her as she almost falls multiple times. This is, of course, a great throwback to the last episode when she says that she really can't deal with heights because she always has the urge to jump. And here we see her very intentionally almost making a very bad mistake. When she finally sits down, she has one of Lyra's dresses laid out on the balcony. We see her take a small wooden box and open it, and she releases what we come to find out are spy flies. I loved seeing this. The spy flies in the movie The Golden Compass were really cool. These spy flies were also really cool in a much darker, grittier way. No surprise there. Boreal meets with an investigator and hands off the dossier of information he has on Stanislaus Grimmen, John Perry. We finally get to see a photo of Will Perry. The Egyptians gather for their buy-in roping. John Fogg gives his speech about all of the Egyptian kids that have been taken and the Egyptian need to pursue the kids, to rescue them, and to bring the gobblers to some kind of justice. As in the book, Raymond von Garrett is one of the Egyptians that stands up and disagrees with John Fogg and says he doesn't think the Egyptians need to continue risking their lives for landloper children, and for Lyra specifically. We hear a bunch of people agreeing with him in the background, and Lyra feels very self-conscious and that she should probably get the hell out of there. She decides not to and instead speaks up. She says that she is afraid, but the kids who've been captured by the gobblers are even more afraid, and the Egyptians can do whatever they want with her, but it is imperative that they pursue the gobblers and that they deal with Mrs. Coulter. This is a big deviation from the book. Lyra does not speak up at the roping at all. I'm sure this is to build our impression of Lyra as a brave girl and someone who's willing to stick up for what she thinks is right, but for me, this fell a little bit flat. Farder tells all of the Egyptians that they're going north, and John Fogg follows up and talks a lot about how this is the time for the Egyptian community to come together to stand up for what they believe in. While he's giving the speech, I couldn't help but notice that he is carrying what looks like an axe or a hammer, something sharp and pointy. To me, this was pretty indicative that the speech itself was not very powerful. They needed some kind of visual prop, and I was very disappointed in this. In the book, this is a great moment when John Fogg really calls out Raymond von Garrett and says, how is it that this little girl is braver than you? Shame on you for not having the strength and the courage to stand up here and do what's right. For me, this speech was lukewarm at best. I'm gonna be brutal. I was incredibly disappointed. There are so many rousing speeches in the history of TV and in the history of HBO. There are so many speeches in Game of Thrones alone that are motivating and brilliant and moving, and I found that this was none of those things. We see Tony and Benjamin de Ruyter break into Mrs. Coulter's apartment building through her elevator shaft, and that is when the shit show starts. The guys head into her study, and they do find some of her papers, but we can hear the golden monkey going through the crawl space of the apartment. Shortly after, Mrs. Coulter emerges with a very big gun, and she shoots Benjamin. He falls to the floor. Mrs. Coulter, in typical Mrs. Coulter fashion, torments the hell out of Benjamin, and the golden monkey has Benjamin's demon in his grasp. Mrs. Coulter does this weird slapping, hitting thing, and then Mrs. Coulter spends some time sitting on top of Benjamin, telling him just how horrible his death is going to be. It's a grisly scene, and it's certainly no surprise that Mrs. Coulter seems to be enjoying every single moment of it. Benjamin takes a moment and actually escapes Mrs. Coulter's grip, and rather than betray his family, as he says, he decides to fling himself down the elevator shaft. It's a traumatic moment. It's definitely supposed to be pretty shocking, and we can see Mrs. Coulter's shock and disappointment on her face. As soon as Benjamin reaches the bottom, we see his demon dissolve into what looks like gold dust, and the golden monkey is watching the dust dissipate. Lyra finally breaks down and tells Farder that she has the alethiometer. She shows it to him, and it's clear that he's seen one before. He explains to her roughly what it does and how to use it, but he tells her there's no way that you're going to be able to use this. You definitely need books to read it, and it takes years of study. Of course, this is Lyra. She is someone special, and as we see her working more and more with the alethiometer, she does get it to work. Her first successful question is what's happening with Benjamin de Ruyter and Tony Costa. As we see Lyra start to understand how the alethiometer works, the idea of negative capability is brought in. We don't ever hear that term, but I know from studying Philip Pullman a lot that the whole method behind the alethiometer is kind of drawn from John Keats's idea of negative capability, that when we're not pursuing something specific in our mind, we're actually capable of doing quite a lot. And that is a terrible paraphrasing of what's a really interesting concept, but I hope we get to see more about that. Lyra rushes to tell Farder about the alethiometer reading, and as she's telling him that she thinks something bad has happened and that Benjamin might be dead, we see the spy flies attack. They've finally found her. Farder is able to capture one. The other flies away. It becomes very clear that the one that flew away is very dangerous. So Farder says, we're leaving for the north and we're leaving immediately. This is when we hear that Farder thinks that Lyra needs to come with them north, not because she is in grave danger, which she is, but because she can read the alethiometer, and that is a much more valuable skill than anything else they have in their arsenal. We see Lyra on a much larger boat, ostensibly heading towards Trollosan. Costa tells Lyra that she is a remarkable girl and that the north doesn't know what's coming at it. This is definitely a special moment because aside from Mrs. Coulter saying you could be extraordinary, this is really the only time an adult has acknowledged Lyra for not only her potential but what she is now. Not to be an ass, but to me, this made me ask myself the question, is this version of Lyra remarkable? And I'm not so sure she is. I know that HBO is trying to give us a more realistic version of the book. The Lyra I see in this series does not have the same gumption. The episode ends with Mrs. Coulter lounging on her couch, fully submerged in her own feelings and frustration, and Lord Boreal finds her and sits down next to her on the couch. The spy fly, the remaining one, re-enters and lands in Mrs. Coulter's hand, and when Lord Boreal realizes what that is, he says, "Are you out of your mind?" This episode left me wanting just a little bit more. I thought that we got through a lot of the logistics and the motions of what this episode should have been plot-wise, but it didn't have the same emotional weight to me that the last episode did. I think, especially with John Faw's speech, it had a lot of potential to be something pretty special, and it didn't get there. I'd also like to see Lyra be the remarkable girl that she is described as. I haven't seen that yet, and I'm looking forward to seeing that as she meets Yorick Burnison in the next episode, and they really really truly venture north. As always, thank you so much for watching. It's been so great to read all of your comments and know that there are people who are just as in love with the series as I am. So thank you again.